Good evening. Tonight, we are starting another new series of lessons, which I hope are beneficial. But tonight's kind of different because we're going to be looking at sort of an introduction to this series. So we'll address a little bit of what we will talk about, but mostly we're trying to set up the whole idea so that when we start to look at these other lessons throughout the year, they'll hopefully make a little bit of sense as to why we're actually looking at them. But the concept for this is to look at strange laws in the Old Testament. And that might sound like a strange idea, but we'll explain why that's necessary and why that's useful in just a minute. But there are strange laws, and maybe we recognize them, maybe we don't. But if you go to the New Testament and you say, well, name a strange law in the New Testament, I don't really know what it would be. There's nothing that just stands out as, well, that doesn't really make any sense why God commanded that. But then if I say, well, go to the Old Testament and find me a strange law, you might have some in mind, or you might not be able to think of any right now, but there are some laws in the Old Testament, and you kind of look at them and you think, well, why would God have commanded that? Or why would he command against that? Or whatever it is, and you ask, well, what's the difference? If God commands things in the New Testament, they kind of make sense, but then we go to the Old Testament and some of the laws don't make sense, and how do we reconcile those? What do we do with those strange laws? And again, tonight we're going to try to introduce this a little bit. So with this series of lessons, most of the lessons, not this one, but most of the lessons will just deal with one law in particular. And we'll look at a strange law from the Old Testament. We'll try to figure out why it was given and how it can apply today. But as we start into this, I hope that this is beneficial to people besides myself. So I do this because I think it makes sense in general, but also because I find it interesting. I think it's interesting to look at the stranger Old Testament laws, but it's also useful because it is part of God's Word. But beyond this, there's another reason that I think is important. We'll explain this toward the end of the lesson. We'll give an example of it, a real-world example or an Old Testament example. There is a whole branch of atheistic argumentation built on Old Testament laws that are kind of weird. So what does that mean? It means people that don't believe in the Bible will point you to some of the stranger laws in the Old Testament and say, well, why do you believe this junk if this is in here? And we can either say, I don't really know why that's in there. Or we can come to them prepared and say, well, let me talk to you for a minute about why exactly this is in there and what God had in mind when he gave this command. Now, there's a world of difference between that, but we'll address that more. But there is a need for us to be able to, but also willing to go beyond just the faith and hope and love of the New Testament and be willing to go back to the Old Testament and say, okay, this is challenging, but there are things I can learn from this. So hopefully one other benefit that we'll get from this is that it will help us to recognize that the Old Testament is not binding today. I know that a lot of people struggle with this. I know, I can't count how many times people have tried to apply the best known part of the Old Testament, the Ten Commandments, to themselves today. The Ten Commandments do not apply to us directly today. That's not the point of this lesson. But they don't apply directly to us today because they were given to the Jews. Now, if those commandments are seen again in the New Testament and commanded again, then sure they apply. But some of the Ten Commandments even don't apply. And certainly most of the rest of the commands don't apply to us in any way. And so when we look at some of these stranger laws, we say, well, that's kind of weird. But remember, they're the same set of laws as the Ten Commandments. And if we don't apply these laws to ourselves, well, why are we trying to apply the others? So hopefully that'll be a benefit. But one other thing that we have to mention as we start into this whole idea is what the purpose of the law is. And you could go a lot of different directions with that, but I'll give you three very simple reasons that God put the old law in place. Three very simple ideas from God to help his people. And that's really what the old law does. But these three things. Purpose number one, God gave the old law to the Jews to keep his people doing right. Or another way to say that, the opposite way of saying that, is God gave them the law so that they would not sin. Or that they would have the teaching at least to tell them what to do to sin or not sin. So that's the first thing. God is trying to get them to be right in his sight, and he's trying to prevent sin. Second reason that God gives the law is to keep them holy. And holy, we can have a weird relationship with the word holy, but holy just means set apart by God and for God's purpose. And so he gives them the old law so that they'll be holy. They'll be his special people. They'll be chosen from the whole earth to be more like him than anyone else and less like the world. So reason number two, so that the Jews will be holy. And the third thing is that the law, in a lot of ways, is meant to keep his people safe. And a lot of the time, they don't necessarily understand what it means to stay safe. They don't understand why it is that they're doing certain things. And yet we today can look at them and say, okay, that does make sense. And a lot of times you look at the food restrictions that they have, and you say, well, okay, they really couldn't prepare that in a way that wouldn't kill them. So that was keeping them safe. Or you look at circumcision, or you look at cleanliness laws, or you look at whatever it is, and you say, okay, well, there was a purpose to that. They just couldn't see it at the time. So those three primary reasons, at least for our purposes tonight. God gives the law to the Jews to say, I want you to do what's right. Also, I want you to be holy, and I also want you to be safe. Those three things are going to come into play as we look at these different laws. And sometimes it'll be one motivation or a couple of these motivations put together. But you have to know these things before you go into the laws, or they don't really make a whole lot of sense. And just to clarify, when I say strange laws of the Old Testament, what exactly do I mean by strange? Well, if you haven't read the Old Testament in a while, then you might not be aware of what I'm talking about. You might not think that there's any strange laws in the Old Testament, but there are. For example, if this doesn't sound strange, then maybe you're strange, but the law of not boiling a goat in its mother's milk, there's a law against it. Why? Honestly, I don't know that I can tell you right now. But we'll have a lesson on it sometime. So it's a strange law. It's also a strange law that you cannot wear clothing made out of both wool and linen. Why? I don't know. Kind of weird, right? It is a strange law. It doesn't make a lot of sense in today's context. There's also a strange law that we'll address a little bit in this lesson, that you are not allowed to eat shellfish. Now, that doesn't really apply to me because I wouldn't anyway, but it's a law. And it's kind of strange that it's in there. And so we look at these laws and we say, well, why? Why would God command these? If God is really an all-powerful, all-knowing being, then why would he command these things that seem either petty or just outright strange to us? So I'll give you my thesis before we move forward, though. And the idea for this, behind this lesson, is that God's laws only seem strange if we don't understand the purpose behind them. And I'll go ahead and mention it now. I wasn't going to until the end of the lesson, but I'll mention it now. God's laws seem strange unless we know the reason behind them. Is it strange for an adult to dunk another adult underwater? Completely out of the Christian context. Is that kind of weird? It's kind of strange. If you don't know that it has the capability of saving sins, it doesn't make a lot of sense. Why would you shove someone else underwater? Usually that's called assault, but in this case, it's different. Because there's context to it, because we know the purpose. And so when we know the purpose of God's laws, even in the Old Testament, then we'll be a lot better able to understand why they were and why they're not maybe as strange as we think. But here's the other question. So this is the second segment of this lesson. Why, in general terms, why were there strange laws in the Old Testament? Or why do we, at least, from a 21st century perspective, think that some of these things are a little bit strange? A few different reasons. Number one reason that we think that things are kind of strange in the Old Testament. It's been about 3,500 years since it was given, since the old law was given. 3,500 years is a very long time. And it's kind of hard for us to comprehend how long that's been, but at the same time, I think if you reverse it, it might make more sense. To say, think of our laws right now. Think of the laws really about anything, criminal law or just driving law or whatever it is. And you say, okay, well, those laws make sense right now. What if you go 3,500 years into the future? How applicable do you think today's laws will be in all situations in the future? You think anything that we have laws about now could sound a little bit strange that far into the future? I'm going to say that a lot of them will seem very odd. I don't even know if there'll be cars at that point, and this isn't like a Back to the Future, 50 years in the future prediction. This is really far out there. So if you go that far into the future, you have no idea what's going to be the case. But when we go that far into the past, it makes sense that things were a lot different. So part of this is just a simple removal of that much time. And of course, some things aren't going to make sense. A second reason behind this, though, that some of these laws seem strange is because a lot of these are given to the Jews, but for the benefit of the Jews because of their neighbors. And I mean that in a national sense. So the nations that surround the Jews. An example of this, if you'll get to Leviticus chapter 18. In Leviticus 18, we're going to look in verse 21. I'll suggest this is kind of a strange law. We're not going to address this in the future, but for right now, we're going to look at this verse. And actually, we're going to look at the next verse in just a few minutes. But Leviticus 18 and verse 21, 18:21, it says, "And you shall not let any of your descendants pass through the fire." And let me just stop there for a second. You're not going to let any of your descendants pass through the fire. Well, okay. Here's the question: were any of you thinking about letting your descendants walk through a fire? Is that something you had planned already? Is that in your will? No? So it sounds kind of strange, but then what's the motivation behind it? Why does God give this law? Well, it says in the rest of the verse, it says, "You shall not let any of your descendants pass through the fire to Molech, nor shall you profane the name of your God, for I am the Lord." Well, who is Molech? Well, Molech is a pagan god. He's one of the gods of the Canaanites, the land that the Israelites have now conquered, but there still exists some of this pagan worship. And so when God says, here's a law for you, sure, the law doesn't make sense out of context, but when you put it in the context that the people around them are doing that, well, then it's necessary. It's necessary to say, well, don't do what they're doing, because they were doing all kinds of evil things, including offering their children as human sacrifices to their pagan gods. And God says, don't do it. So again, you wouldn't have even thought to do that, but God commands it because it has to be commanded. It's sort of responsive, but it needs to be there because the temptation to worship in the same way as these pagans around them do is there. Third thing, we kind of mentioned this, but holiness. So sometimes the law will seem strange to us because it ties more to holiness than it does to practical reasons. So the example for this is a very well-known law of the Old Testament, which is that you're to keep the Sabbath day and make it holy. Okay, well, is there any reason, practically speaking, civilly speaking, for safety reasons, for staying away from sin even, is there any reason to not work on Saturday from a practical perspective? I mean, it's kind of nice, I guess, to not work on a Saturday. But what's the reason for it? Well, the reason can't be found in the safety side of things. It's not really found in the sinful or not side of things. But instead, it's to be holy, because he is the Lord your God. And the Lord God rested on the seventh day from his work, and so you're going to do the same thing, because you're not like the nations around you. So the law is not for any practical purpose, but it's just because of holiness. So sometimes when we see a strange law in the Old Testament, it's because it was supposed to make people a little more like God, not because it was supposed to make sense in earthly terms. Another part of this is cleanliness. So kind of the same thing that we mentioned before with certain food laws and other things, but sometimes it is cleanliness. Again, if you look at food laws, they were not allowed to eat pigs. Now, this is a legitimate question. Is there ever a good reason to not eat bacon? Nope. There is never a good reason to not eat bacon, unless you are not able to prepare that bacon in such a way that it won't be harmful to you. And so it was at that time, that they could not preserve the meat well enough to keep it safe and sanitary for their eating. And so God says, you're not going to eat it. Well, not because it makes you more holy than another nation, and not necessarily because it keeps you away from sin, but instead because it keeps you safe. So again, sometimes it doesn't make a lot of sense in one context or viewing it through one lens, but if you're looking through the right lens, then it will make a lot of sense. And then the last thing I'll say as far as why some of the laws are so strange is that there is, throughout God's plan, a certain incremental moral teaching. That's probably not the best way to say that, but let me explain it. We talked about this a little bit on Wednesday, actually. We said under the patriarchal system, there was sin, and there were commands from God, but they were very limited. If you go all the way back to Adam, there's really only one command. Don't do this, and then they do that. And then you go down the line to Noah, and people were wicked, and they were sinful, and God killed them for it. But if you look at the patriarchs, they have very little law. And then the law of Moses comes into effect, and it's better. It is better. And it creates a system of law and a system of rules. And yet, there's a better system still that's coming under Christ. So God didn't reveal every moral teaching that he wanted humanity to know from the beginning. And you could ask why God did that, and that's way beyond this lesson. But God, for his purposes, decided to reveal his moral truth slowly over time. Maybe not to overwhelm humanity, maybe because it wouldn't work until Christ was here. But whatever the reason, God waited. And so when we go back to the Old Testament and we see the law, we can't expect the law to be perfect the way that the New Testament law is. And we can't expect it to be complete as the New Testament law is. And that's why you see in the New Testament places where Jesus says, well, you've heard it say, do not murder. But I say to you, if you hate your brother in your heart, then you've already committed murder within your heart. Matthew chapter 5, verse 21. So, okay, we can't do that either. And then if you go to Matthew chapter 19, verse 6, then Jesus says about marriage that you've heard it said before, but he says, Moses allowed you to get a divorce or present a certificate of divorce because of the hardness or the stubbornness of your hearts. So under the old law, some things weren't finished. The law wasn't finished. It wasn't as good as it is now. And some things were allowed just because people couldn't accept it yet. And so when we look back at the Old Testament, we have to recognize sometimes the laws don't make sense because they don't make sense yet, because they're incomplete. So why does this matter? We've looked now at kind of our introduction to this series, but we've also asked the question, to answer the question, hopefully, why are there some strange laws? But why does any of that matter? Well, it matters in the sense that we as Christians have a weakness when it comes to this subject. And it makes sense in a way because we are bound by the New Testament, not the Old Testament, so we focus more on the New Testament than the Old Testament. But at the same time, we have a weakness here. And we mentioned it at the beginning, but it's sort of an Achilles heel that we know less than we should about the old law. And because we know less than we should about the old law on the whole, it means that it's somewhere that people can trap us or catch us in something that we don't want to get caught in. And again, we're susceptible to these kind of atheistic arguments that say, well, is this really a message from some grand deistic being if it has these kind of laws in it? But we can get more specific than that as well. But if atheists are able to come to us and say, well, is this really God's word? Is this really the work of some God? Because there are all these problems with it. And if we, in our ignorance, say, I don't really know. I mean, you're right, that does sound kind of strange. Well, then two things have happened. One, I've lost ground with someone that could come closer to God. But two, I've lost ground in my own life. And I've lost my capability to defend the faith, but also I've probably lost a little bit of my own faith and create a little bit of doubt that doesn't need to be there. So a more concrete example of this, and I've heard this in debates and I've heard people attempt to make this argument, but if we're talking about the subject of homosexuality, we're going to bring that in. And we're going to go to the old law, because the old law mentions homosexuality. And we're going to say, well, is homosexuality wrong or is it right? Well, let me give you a Bible verse for that. Let's go back to Leviticus chapter 18, verse 22. So if I look in Leviticus chapter 18, verse 22, and I say, well, I've got it right here, and I'm going to prove to you that God is against homosexuality. And I read this verse, and I say, Leviticus 18:22, you shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. There you go. That's all you have to say, right? Well, what's the problem? That is true, and God did say that, and that is part of his law. And so you say, well, okay, that's pretty good evidence. Except there's a problem. And this is where the atheist will point this out. The problem with your logic and the problem that we have to address as Christians. So in this context, we're saying homosexuality is wrong because God has a law against it, but also because it's an abomination, as God says. Well, back up a few chapters now with me, and I'll take you the road of the atheist. To chapter 11, Leviticus 11, we're going to start reading verse 10. Leviticus 11, verse 10. So same book, just a few chapters before it. Verse 10, but all in the seas or in the rivers that do not have fins and scales, and all that move in the water, any living thing which is in the water, they are an abomination to you. And they shall be an abomination to you, and you shall not eat their flesh, but you shall regard their carcasses as an abomination. Verse 12, whatever is in the water, but does not have fins or scales, that shall be an abomination to you. If you go on the text, there's a few more things that are listed as abominations as far as food is concerned, certain birds and other things that we're not allowed, or that they were not allowed to eat. But what does God call them? Well, he calls them abomination. Well, now we're back to that point that we brought up earlier, that strange law that God says you can't eat shellfish. Now, it actually is a little broader than this, but you can't eat things that swim but don't have fins or scales. Well, that would include shellfish, as in lobsters and crabs and crawfish. So you can't have those as a Jew. It will also apply to mollusks, not that we really eat those, but oysters or clams. I don't eat oysters, but I think God was right about that. It didn't carry in the New Testament, but I think God was right. But whenever we take this verse now and we say, well, it's an abomination to eat shellfish too. Well, now what has the atheist done? Well, he's come from your verse where you said, God said homosexuality is an abomination. And he's taken your abomination and said, oh, well, I guess you're not going to go to Red Lobster, huh? And if you can't eat shellfish, and if that's just as much an abomination as homosexuality, well, then who's right here? Is it that this old book is right? This thousands of years old book is correct? Doesn't seem likely, right? Instead, it seems more likely that just as much as shellfish isn't an abomination to anyone, that neither is homosexuality, right? So that's the argument that's made. Well, if we don't know the old law, then what do we have to say? Well, I guess that's true. But if we know the old law, then maybe there is an answer to this. And maybe there's an answer that makes sense. But from an atheistic perspective, one abomination is just as bad as another abomination, and it doesn't make a lot of sense why shellfish is called that, but so is homosexuality. So how do we make sense of this? Well, there's really a twofold problem here. The first problem is that we've gone to the Old Testament to defend something from the New Testament. Please don't do that. Why? Because this is going to happen every time. The second you go back to the Old Testament, then there's a whole world of possibilities where someone that doesn't believe in the Bible in the first place can point to and say, oh, well, you know what else happened in the Old Testament? Yeah, there's a lot of things that happen in the Old Testament that aren't necessarily good moral things, and they'll be more than happy to point this out. So don't go to the Old Testament to prove something that the New Testament commands. It's the first problem. The second problem, though, is that it's actually true. Now, as crazy as that sounds, eating shellfish is an abomination in the eyes of God at this time, just as much so as homosexuality. Now, does that mean that they're equal sins? I don't really want to get into that. Eating shellfish, I guess if it were a lifestyle, in a sense, would be just as bad. But are they equal in every way? Well, no, and we don't really think that they are. We see homosexuality as being over here and shellfish as being down here. And of course, we really see it as being an Old Testament problem anyway, and it is. So they are both an abomination, though. How is that possible? Well, the word abomination, or sometimes it's translated detestable, it means what it sounds like. It means it's something that is abhorred by the person. They just hate it. And that's true. Does it matter what you're talking about if God commanded against it? No, because God thinks all sin is an abomination. And if God says, do not do this, it's an abomination. And if he says, do not do this, it's an abomination, whether it's shellfish or whether it's homosexuality. So part of the problem is that it's actually true. And yet, when we look at it today, we say, well, those things don't seem equal. But at the time, they were both commands that God had given not to do something, and so they are an abomination. So we have to recognize that as well. Now, that's kind of the simple explanation. We can go farther into that, and some people do, and some people, I'm not even going to mention that, but there's an argument to be made from cleanliness here as well, just like there is with eating pork of any kind. Shellfish are unable to digest certain things, which means that they have a lot of dirt in them and mercury and other trace metals. And so they're not super safe to eat compared with other foods. So sure, that's an argument to be made, but really the very simple explanation is both are an abomination at the time that they're given. But again, the problem is I've tried to take an Old Testament verse to prove something that I should have gone to the New Testament to prove, because that's what I live by, not by the Old Testament. So today, though, if we're looking at this same question of homosexuality versus shellfish, then today, how does this apply? Well, again, that's why I should have been in the New Testament to start with. Because in the New Testament, what do I know? Well, I know a couple things. I know Peter had a vision where there was a sheet filled with all kinds of animals, and Jesus told him to rise, kill, and eat. You remember this story that takes place? And Peter says, I can't do that. These things are unclean. And Jesus says, actually, don't call any of it unclean. What I've made clean. And all foods are now acceptable. And Paul says that as well. And there's no longer an unclean nature to shellfish. And so in the New Testament, shellfish are no longer an abomination. Why? Because the only reason they ever were is because God commanded against it. Now that God has ceased to command against it, it's no longer an abomination. Great. Is that true of homosexuality? No, it's not. If you go to Romans chapter 1, verses 26 through 28, you're going to find exactly that. And you can go other places in the New Testament as well, but it's clear that God has continued the same feeling toward homosexuality all throughout his dispensations, all throughout his different laws. So that's the difference between those two. But if we just look at that verse and we say, well, God said homosexuality is an abomination. That's true, but be ready for what's going to come next when you say that. And people will just point out that the Old Testament has a lot of other questionable aspects to it. Now, that's going to happen in the New Testament as well if you're talking to someone that is an atheist, but at least you're going to be in safer water to start with than being out of your depth and out of my depth in the Old Testament with these laws. So do these strange laws in general apply today, whatever these laws are? Whether it's about shellfish or about different kinds of material in the same clothing or about boiling a goat in its mother's milk or whatever it is. Do they apply today? No. And the general answer to the commands of the Old Testament applying today is no, they don't, unless the New Testament restates them and recommands them. We live under the New Testament law, and that is all we live by. And so unless the New Testament brings forward that command from the Old, then it does not apply. That's true even of some of the 10 Commandments, and it's certainly true of some of the other 613. So do they apply today? No, not unless they've been recommanded in the New Testament. But where does this leave us after looking at these questions tonight? Well, it hopefully leaves us in a position where we are willing to learn. and willing to put a little bit of study into these questions because they are legitimate, because they have a purpose to them, and because they can cause us real danger in our own faith, or certainly in defending the faith as a whole. But we have to be willing to study to the point that we don't get caught in trying to apply the Old Testament where the New Testament should apply, or in trying to reference something that ultimately is going to get defeated by itself or within the same book. So we must be willing to study. We must be willing to put in the time to learn these things. And hopefully we're going to do that this year. This is one of the series. There's also going to be a series that we do that's just how to study the Bible. So hopefully that will kind of pair with this and be worthwhile in learning a little bit more from Old Testament and New Testament. As we said actually kind of in the middle of the lesson, the laws of the New Testament seem normal to us now, but it's because we know the purpose for them. This morning we took the Lord's Supper. Anyone that wasn't here this morning is going to in just a minute, but is it normal to have a little cup of juice and a little piece of bread in the middle of a meeting with a bunch of people? Not really. That doesn't happen any other time, except preschool maybe, but it doesn't happen in the rest of our life, so why does it happen here? Well, because there's a reason behind it. And as we said earlier in the lesson, baptism on its surface seems kind of strange. Why would you dunk someone else underwater? It doesn't really make any sense, unless, of course, you come into contact with the blood of Christ. And if that happens, then it makes total sense. This evening, if you've not been baptized, or more importantly, as we said this morning, if this evening you've not been converted, this is your opportunity. This is your chance. We're extending God's invitation to you. I hope to see you again, but we're not always guaranteed that will happen. So this evening is your best opportunity. If there's anything that you need, if there's anything that the church can help with, we ask you to come forward now as we stand and as we sing.